There's a chemical fog outside our school. If our body makes contact with the fog, we'll be eaten out clean. The view from our classroom windows is nothing but a murky white. I bet if I went outside and looked down, I wouldn't be able to see past my knees. I won't be going outside, though. I honestly don't think I'll leave this classroom for a while. Our class, Gothic Literature, was supposed to end at 1:30. I remember just staring at the clock, watching the seconds tick by, feeling Mr. Sampson's voice drone through my body, the monotone sound killing me into a haze of sleepy existence. I didn't get much sleep last night, and it certainly shows. The classroom was lit solely by the fluorescent bulbs flickering on the ceiling, Sampson having closed the blinds to avoid distracted glances about 15 minutes in. I wonder now if we would have noticed the building fog outside had the blinds been open. Maybe we would have clambered together by the window, whispering in excitement to each other, anything that wasn't hearing, for the 10th time that week, how revolutionary Mary Shelley was for that time. Or hearing Susan beg him to cover Carmilla, just for half a lesson, Mr. Sampson? It isn't unusual for a mess of high schoolers to grow distracted and excited at any little change. I mean, who can blame us, with the constant repetition? Regardless, I've gone too far off topic. It was about 10 minutes before the bell was supposed to buzz, signifying the 7-minute long break from our daily torture, that the intercom system crackled to life. We will now be having a lockdown drill. We request everyone stay calm, and follow the instructions of their current teacher. If you're outside your classroom, we ask that you please make your way back in a timely manner. Thank you. I heard the collective groans of students who didn't want to crawl under their desks in the dark. Really, the only thing worse than this lecture is the singular sound of your desk mates breathing penetrating a heavy cover of silence. Nevertheless, we're used to lockdown drills by now. The class shuffled slowly, desks creaking as students stood and crouched. Susan shoved herself under the teacher's desk, whilst Jamie and Audrey stood shoulder to shoulder in the tiny alcove just behind the doorway. We all waited with frustrated bated breaths, knowing that in just a few seconds we'd hear someone try the doorknob, apparently to scare us. It never works, and then the intercom system announced the drill was over. But those sounds didn't come. Instead, all there was? Silence. The reintroduction of sound started with a couple in the back corner whispering and giggling to each other. Students, growing more impatient, began talking to each other. It took 10 minutes before Mr. Sampson himself moved to his desk, shooing Susan out in the process, in an attempt to get some work done. 10 more minutes passed. He grew frustrated, and motioned us back to our seats. That was when someone peeked outside. I'm not sure what they were looking for, maybe to see if this was a different sort of drill, or if maybe it wasn't a drill at all. It didn't take long for everyone else to be made aware of the oddity that was the outside world. Hey guys? I can't see outside. It's like, hella foggy. I think her name was Ashley. I worked on a lab project with her once. Shit, she's right. A guy chimed in from across the room. Jesus, that's some massive blockage. Imagine driving in that. It can't be foggy, it's not even humid out. Plus, already lunchtime. Way too late for fog. Susan snorted. You know, like a smartass. Well, it's clearly something. Do you think it's fucking with the cell phone towers? I don't have any reception. Ashley spoke again. Guys, come on. No phones in class. We just touched on this day before yesterday. Despite Sampson's protests, there was a quiet murmur of agreement. People who'd either checked their phones prior and noticed the same thing, or those who were checking them now and, well, noticing the same thing. Weather does screwy things, guys. Who knows? I finally interjected my own opinion, shrugging my shoulders. A few more murmurs, slowly growing louder in volume as friends and deskmates began talking to each other to alleviate the boredom. 5 minutes later, whatever the weather is doing to our phones clearly has done something else. Our electric went out. We could still connect to the Wi-Fi, obviously. I'm writing this, aren't I? But nothing else. Lights burned out, the projector wouldn't turn on, even the hum of the air conditioner that we hardly notice anymore just went silent. It was around 2 o'clock we heard the first scream. It was horrible and blood-curdling, and it came from outside. We could hear it reverberate from the glass window, cold to the touch. As I'd find out later, the first of many screams to come. Some kid had decided to go outside. We didn't know that yet, though. Mr. Sampson had clearly had enough. I'm going to check with Ms. Young next door. Stay put. Lock the door behind me. I'll be back shortly. Standing from his desk, he took brisk steps to the classroom door, exiting with the confidence only an authority figure has. We followed his instructions. For a while, at least. Minutes ticked by. Finally, around 2:30, we decided to just leave. What were they going to do? We'd been left with no guidance. Just a bunch of kids who totally didn't know better, right? It was cold outside as I passed the threshold. You know when you enter a Walmart at midnight, and everything is just weird? Like you're on a different plane? That's kind of what this felt like. The halls were dark. Silent. The only light strewn in through the double doors in Hall B, casting large shadows behind doorways. The fog pressed against the door, almost ominously. I'm leaving. The guy from earlier shrugged, headed towards the doorway. What if they turn the alarms on? The doors will sound. Especially if we're on a lockdown. Ashley pointed out. Power's out. I doubt they are. He called from behind him. I only looked over at him when I heard the doors open. Immediately, he began screaming. He jerked away from the door, as if he'd been burned. The air smelled like chlorine and bleach. Maybe a bit of formaldehyde that the zoology class uses during exams. The doors swung shut the second he let go, the fog quickly dissipating. Audrey rushed over to him, trying to help. "What's the matter, Josh?" She set a hand on his shoulder before jerking her own hand back, letting out a sharp exhale as if she'd been burned. Because she had. She seemed to notice the situation almost instantly, shrinking back from the cowering boy in front of her, now letting out raspy and crackling moans of pain. It reminded me of someone with pneumonia, the sound of it. Burning. His skin was burning. Bright red and blistering, and so was the palm of Audrey's hand. "It's a chemical burn." "What touched them?" "There's a shower in the science lab. We should get them there." "How did this happen?" 30 voices, all at once. We split up, in the end. 5 of them headed to 2B, the lab with the supposed shower. The rest of us headed into the classroom, half of us eerily quiet, the other chattering in confusion and alarm. And here we are, folks. A couple hours later, in a classroom surrounded by white. A fog of chemicals. We should find someone who knows what's going on. We can't just sit here, can we? And yet, that's exactly what we're doing. I'm posting this. You guys seem to know your way out of some, less than ideal situations. I'm at a loss. I'm scared. My daughter has been doom scrolling for 14 hours. I just figured out the horrifying reason why she is doing it. I had heard a knock on the door. But when I opened it, no one was there. I looked around. Nothing. Then I looked down. And saw it. Lying there on the doorstep was an old cell phone with a cracked screen. I picked it up and clicked the home button. It opened without a passcode, revealing a home screen with only one app. "Rebecca?" I called out to my 18-year-old daughter, as I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. "You know anything about the cell phone I just found on the doorstep?" "On the doorstep?" She called back from the living room, likely scrolling away on her own phone. "Yeah, with a big crack in it?" "Nope. I guess I'll just throw it out then." "Wait, I want to see," she cried out, her curiosity piqued, as she made her way over to the kitchen. I held it up for her to see. "Ew. Looks old. Like from when you and Mom were growing up." "When your mom and I were growing up, there were no cell phones, Becca." "Sounds boring." Yeah, it was. Perfectly boring. In the best way possible. Now look at what's become of the world. Yeah, let me see it," she said, snatching the old cracked cell phone out my hand. "What's the passcode?" "There isn't one." She opened it. "Just one app? This phone is so mid." "Mid?" I asked, unfamiliar with her Gen Z slang. "It means like mediocre, Dad. Where'd you find this thing, anyway?" "I told you, on the doorstep. Someone knocked and ran away." "So it's some sort of prank?" "If it is, it's a pretty mid prank," I replied, giving her the same smug look I always did when I landed a dad joke. "Ew, your jokes are not funny, Dad. Anyways, I'm gonna see what's in the app," Rebecca said, as she scurried off back to the living room, and proceeded to scroll away on the cracked old phone. "Cool, let me know what you find, Becca," I said casually, as I sat back down at the dinner table and continued reading my newspaper. An hour or so later, my wife Erica returned home from work, and we had dinner. "Rebecca, it's dinner time," Erica called out from the kitchen. But my daughter didn't reply. "Becca?" I added. But again, Rebecca ignored us. My wife and I both looked at each other and rolled our eyes. "Your loss. Food'll be cold again," Erica said, referring to the countless other times our social media-obsessed teen had forgone dinner so long that the meal had become cold. "Kids," I muttered under my breath. "So how was work, honey?" A few hours later, my wife and I decided to go upstairs for the night and, seeing that Rebecca was still scrolling away on the couch, reminded her that her dinner was on the table. Once again, our daughter just ignored us, as she continued to scroll away on her phone. Something that, after raising an 18-year-old daughter, I was very used to. But this time, something was different. This time, she was scrolling on a different phone. The old cracked phone I had found on the doorstep, to be precise. She's still using that old thing? Wonder what app was on there? Must be some game or social media thing. I thought to myself. Just remember to turn the lights out before you go to bed, Becca. My wife called down, before we retired to our bedroom, to no reply. But the next morning, not only did we find the lights on, but we also found Rebecca still sitting there. Sure enough, scrolling away on the old cracked phone. "Rebecca," my wife called out. "Did you even sleep last night?" "Yeah, Becca, you really shouldn't be pulling all-nighters like that," I added, as I went to the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. But before I could make it that far, something caught my eye on the kitchen table. To my disbelief, there was Rebecca's dinner. Still sitting there. Completely untouched. That's when I knew that something was very wrong. By the time my wife and I were able to pry the old cracked cell phone out of our daughter's hands, Rebecca had gone into a sudden fit of rage. "Give it back," she screamed, her eyes cold and lifeless. I tossed the phone to Erica behind me, while I stood between her and our daughter. I said, "Give it back." Rebecca screamed again, in a threatening fashion. "Becca, what's gotten into you?" It's just an old phone. And a cracked one at that, I began. But before I could continue, my innocent daughter, who had never laid a finger on a soul her entire life, suddenly lunged at me, swung her arm, and ran her nails across my face, tearing the flesh from my skin and causing blood to pour down my neck. "Rebecca," I yelled, raising my voice. But it was too late. She had already hopped over me and chased my wife into the kitchen. When I finally caught up to her at the entrance to the kitchen, I saw my daughter standing there with a steak knife on one side of the kitchen table, while my wife stood on the other, shaking in fear, as she held the old cracked phone in her hand. "What was on that app?" I asked hypothetically out loud, realizing that whatever my daughter had discovered on the phone must have been the cause of her 14-hour doom scroll and subsequent fit of rage. But Erica must have taken me literally, immediately opening the phone and going to the app. I saw a perplexed look wash over my wife's face as she took her finger, placed it on the phone's cracked surface, and started to scroll. "No. Erica, stop," I cried out as I ran over to her and ripped the phone from her hand. But before I could even process what had happened, I heard the steak knife that my daughter was holding fall to the kitchen floor, before she too collapsed to the ground. "Becca?" I asked, confused by her sudden change of disposition, but at the same time, relieved that her fit of rage had ceased. That's when I heard a growl behind me, as my daughter's rage had somehow shifted to my wife, and Erica picked up the knife from the floor. "Give it back," my wife screamed, her eyes now cold and lifeless. I looked down at my daughter, who looked as if she had just awoken from a trance. That's when I realized that whatever curse had been bestowed upon the old cracked phone's app seemed to only affect the last person who used it. I took my dazed daughter by the hand and led her out of the kitchen, out of the house, and to the driveway, as my wife followed, still wielding the knife. "Get in," I insisted, as I opened my car door, and Rebecca hopped inside, before I used my key fob to lock her inside. "Give me the phone," my wife cried from behind me, as she swung the knife at me. I stepped aside, and watched its blade pierce the hood of my car. I thought to call out my wife's name, in an attempt to snap her out of it, but immediately realizing that there was only one way to snap her out of her trance. As she struggled to pull the blade out of the car, I seized the opportunity to run back in the house and turn on the sink in the first floor bathroom. Eventually, my wife came back inside looking for me and, sure enough, headed for the source of the running water. And when she stepped inside, I hopped out from behind the kitchen island, slamming the door behind her, before dragging a nearby bookshelf against the door and reinforcing it with a few other heavy objects. "Give me the phone," I heard her cry out from inside the bathroom, as I looked at the old cracked cell phone that I was still gripping in my hand, and knew what I had to do. 30 minutes later, the deed was done. The old cracked cell phone, left on a random neighbor's doorstep in the next town over, where I hoped no one would recognize me. When I got back to the car, my daughter was just sitting there in the passenger seat, still traumatized and speechless from what she had just gone through. We drove home in silence. And when we finally got back, we waited by the barricaded bathroom door, as my wife continued to scream. And waited. And waited. Until eventually, she stopped. I slid the heavy objects and bookshelf aside and opened the bathroom door, to find Erica just standing there, as if waking from a bad dream, the same exhausted expression on her face that I'd seen previously on my daughter. It had worked. My wife was no longer possessed by the vile device. Erica walked over and hugged me. I looked over at my daughter. She smiled. I smiled back. In that moment, two things became clear. 1. Someone else had been possessed by the phone prior to leaving it on my doorstep. 2. Someone new was possessed by it now. But all that mattered to me in that moment was that my family was okay. I wish I could say that after the dust settled, my daughter swore off cell phones, social media, and apps altogether. But the truth is, it only took a day before she was back to doom scrolling on her own phone. Now every time she does, and her dinner gets cold, I can't help but fear that she's been possessed again, but then I realize she's just a teenager. I was hired to be a babysitter for $200 an hour. When I got there I found out I was babysitting a washing machine. "Pardon?" I responded, incredulously. £200 per hour, Susan repeated. "Yeah," I replied. "But you said I'd be babysitting a..." "No, I must have misheard you. Where's the child?" "Child?" Stephen laughed. "We don't have children." "You heard me correctly, George. Just watch the machine for a few hours," Susan said. "That's all, isn't it, Stephen?" "Indeed, Susan," Stephen chuckled. "Honestly, this new generation. You'd think they could handle babysitting a washing machine, wouldn't you?" "You would," Susan laughed. "Perhaps we should write it on a piece of paper for him?" "He probably needs to be told through the medium of TikTok," Stephen said. The pair of them laughed, and I stifled the irritated huff that was itching to emerge from my tightly compressed lips. They were insufferable, but £200 per hour of babysitting was a staggering offer. It would have been staggering if I'd been offered that much to care for an actual person, but a washing machine? Let them have their fun, I thought. I was certain I'd have the last laugh. And so, I bit my tongue. "No," I said, smiling. "I think I've got it." "Good lad," Stephen said, ruffling my hair in a patronizing fashion. "May I take your coat?" I shrugged, but Stephen had already slipped it off my shoulders before I could respond. He disappeared upstairs, which seemed a little peculiar, given they had a coat stand by the door, but I didn't question it. "We'll see you at 11 o'clock. Okay?" Susan asked. I nodded, waving as they left. I lifted a middle finger as soon as the door had shut behind them. I was about to make the easiest 800 pounds of my life. Maybe more, if they stay out longer, I thought. Stephen and Susan Hall had always been the oddballs of the street. Nobody really knew them. And, despite their insistence to the contrary, I could have sworn they had kids, Tim and Rachel. Mom and Dad seemed to think not, which is they were confused when the Halls offered me the babysitting gig over the Christmas break. When I found myself eyeballing a washing machine in their kitchen, I started to realize that my parents were probably right. There had never been a Tim or a Rachel. But I wasn't complaining about the bizarre request. As a broke university student, the thought of making eye-watering money in a single night had me salivating in seconds. As soon as the Halls popped round to make the offer, I rushed over to their house at the end of the street without another thought. Anyway, after that rude conversation with the Halls, I initially planned to not even bother babysitting the washing machine. But I was so glad I eventually peered through the oval window because I was treated to a sight of unexpected hilarity. A mountain of miniature outfits circled the rumbling drum. There must have been hundreds of items in there, all of them too small for any human to wear, and some were far more shrunken than others. It was a mismatched collection. Of course they're washing doll clothing, I thought, laughing aloud. Absolute nut jobs. Of course, I immediately sent pictures to my friends. "No way," Johnny replied. "Those two are so weird. I can't believe you're not babysitting actual humans. Didn't we play with their kids when we were growing up?" Sarah asked. "That's what I said to my parents," I replied. "But they didn't think so. And Stephen and Susan said they don't have any children." "Oh, but they do," Johnny said. "Their beautiful baby washing machine." I snorted. "Also, I'm just thinking about the photos you sent," Johnny continued. "I think I recognize the teensy tiny t-shirt in the second picture. The one with the green turtle on it. See it? Oh my word, Tim wore that." "Well, a larger version of that," Sarah messaged. "Yeah, that name rings a bell," Johnny said. My heart dropped. "Wait, Tim? Okay, this is getting weird now." I was part joking about them having kids, but that's the exact name I had in my head. Before my friends could respond, the doorbell rang. The sudden ding startled me, and my phone clattered to the tiles below, screen shattering dramatically. I groaned. Of course. I scooped up my wounded technological appendage, sighed at the screen I could no longer read, and placed the fallen soldier on the dining table. I stormed to the front of the house, ready to scowl at whoever had unwittingly caused my phone's demise, but when I flung the door open, nobody was there. Though I was certain I could hear a faint wailing sound in the wind, as if a distant scream were striving to capture my attention. With a heavy sigh, I closed the door and returned to the kitchen, frustrated that a sizable portion of the night's earnings would be going towards fixing my phone screen. I squinted at the device's splintered screen, but it was useless. I couldn't read what my friends had replied. Suddenly, my attention diverted to an unusual noise from the washing machine's innards. A sound that was hard to distinguish, though it had some sort of subconscious effect on my body, lining my skin with a wave of goosebumps and upright hairs, much like the wailing wind at the front door. It sounded like a chorus of piercing shrieks. I knelt onto the kitchen tiles, sighing as my jeans pressed into shattered pieces of my phone screen, and stared deeply into the whirlpool of minuscule clothes which filled the washing machine. The rumble of the drum, the rustling of a tire, and the whooshes of water mostly drowned out the mysterious noise. But it was there. I hadn't imagined it. A choral pang of despair. And then I saw something which filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A fleshy creature, half the size of a pinky finger, slithered between two items of clothing. I yelled and immediately fell backwards, unable to pinpoint what I had seen, but entirely certain it was no insect. No animal. I hurriedly smashed every button on the washing machine, desperate to end the cycle. I'm not sure why my instinct wasn't to run, my brain wasn't functioning correctly. I waited a few minutes for the water to drain from the drum, watching the still pile of tiny outfits. My body shook violently, anticipating movement from within the clothing. But there was nothing. No fleshy monstrosity pounced out at me. And then there came the dreaded ding to signify that the door was safe to open. The drenched pile of clothes sat motionlessly, and I spent several minutes summoning the courage to rummage through it. The never-ending piercing sound was louder now. It was a muffled noise coming from the bottom of the clothes pile. I scarcely dared to look. Shrunken garments slipped through my fingers, and it was only upon closer inspection that I came to a horrifying realization. The outfits were stained with blood and some sort of indistinguishable mush. I could feel the vomit rising in my mouth, but I was as I uncovered the final layer of clothes at the bottom of the drum that I finally unloaded the contents of my stomach. A graveyard of flesh lay against the drum. There were hundreds of shrunken bodies, horribly disfigured, bloodied, and mushed. But the worst part was that some of the miniaturized victims were still moving. The indiscernible peach-colored things were people. And the piercing choral sound was that of their screaming. One of the less mangled people began to crawl over the smaller mound of clothes I'd created in the clearing. He was calling to me in a small, feeble voice. "Save us. Help," he cried repeatedly. I watched in paralyzed fear, trying to decide whether it would be safe for me to reach the palm of my hand inside the drum to scoop out the few people still moving. The man who had wriggled free from the mound of bodies seemed wounded and helpless, but I was terrified of touching that horror scene. With a deep breath, I outstretched my hand, placing it palm side up on the clothes at the bottom. And as the tiny man, along with a few other survivors, clambered onto my skin, I tried to conceal the shivers that spread throughout my body. The first man continued to shout as I steadily lifted my hand closer to my ear. But I soon realized I'd misheard him the first time. Not save us. Help. Save yourself. What's happening? I whispered weakly. What? Didn't you see Grace outside? The man screamed into my ear. My body shivered as I realized that must have been who rang the doorbell, the tiny voice I heard wailing in the wind. It doesn't matter now. Just find your coat and get out of here. He screeched in a minute voice. Why do I need my coat? I asked, gulping. Because they'll shrink it to shrink you. I don't know how or why they do it, but it happened to all of us. I moved my hand to eye level, surveying the 6 survivors, 5 of whom were writhing on my palm. Only the main man seemed to be in any sort of fit state. Are you Tim? I asked quietly. What? Oh, the boy, he sighed. No, the Halls put their children somewhere special. Never mind that. Come on, you need to find your coat. I looked at the clock on the wall. Relax. It's 8 o'clock. They're not getting back until 11. They never went anywhere. The man screamed. In a near synchronized manner, the house's lights extinguished. Oh no. The small man whispered. They know. I'm getting out of here, I said, stumbling through the darkness. If you leave, that coat goes in the next cycle, and you become like us, the man warned. Or worse. And I didn't need to question what he meant. I'd seen the pulverized bodies at the bottom of the drum. Given the inexplicable nature of the tiny human in the palm of my hand, I had reason to believe every last word he'd said. So, I made my way across the darkened entryway, opened the front door, and placed the miniature figures on the paving slabs. Go, I said. I could hear faint pain sounds from the ground as the man said something inaudible to me before helping his injured companions. Then, I stepped back into the lightless house, pulling out my shattered phone to use the flashlight. Thankfully, the screen still seemed to register my touch. Making my way up creaking stairs, the stillness of the house filled me with absolute terror, given I knew that the Halls were lurking somewhere within those 4 walls. And when I reached the upstairs landing, a door opened at the far end. A darkened bedroom beckoned. I knew it to be a trap, but I had no choice, according to the small man I had saved. Not that I could trust him either. Stephen. Sarah? I called. I just want my coat. Then I'll go. I stepped into a large, lightless children's room. There were 2 single beds and, most horrifyingly, a doll on each. Dolls that looked exactly like the 2 children I was completely certain I'd never imagined at all, Tim and Rachel. But they weren't dolls. And they weren't alive. They seemed to have been shrunken and stuffed. I threw up on the floor, and the light in the house suddenly returned, as Stephen and Susan entered the room through a side door. People are so weak these days, Stephen's voice growled. This generation sickens me. Susan sniffled. But not our children. They were pure. I cried. Why are you doing this to people? Why? Stephen frowned, frothing at the lips and brandishing my coat in his tight grip. To save our children, you ignorant fool. Your life will finally mean something. And seeing as you couldn't even wait for the next washing cycle, I guess we should head downstairs and start it now. You're insane. Save them? Your children are dead. Look at what you've done to them. I cried, gesturing at the doll-sized, pale-faced corpses in the beds. Susan shrieked. Quiet, you foul thing. We didn't kill them. This was the only way to save them. Save your energy, honey, Stephen said, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. It's his turn now. And there's no running for him or his escaped friends. We'll catch them. We always do. Heart pounding, an idea came to me. An idea so horrific that I didn't want to believe it had stemmed from my own brain. I stepped backwards and slammed the bedroom door closed. Then, I turned on my heel and ran to the top of the stairs, ignoring the cackling sounds behind me. I scurried down the stairs, 2 at a time, and beelined for the coat stand by the door, scooping up 2 coats, one for Stephen, and one for Susan. Hearing footsteps slowly plodding across the upstairs landing, I darted to the kitchen, realizing I had mere moments before I was caught. I threw the coats into the washing machine, ignoring the blood and guts within, and shut the door. It's useless, George, Stephen shouted, heading down the stairs. You won't find any weapons in this house. But you can run. Go for it. I pressed the start button and, in a stroke of genius, hammered the plastic handle off the door, preventing it from being opened. Stephen suddenly emerged in the kitchen doorway, coat in hand and frown on his face. What are you? He stopped mid-sentence and dropped the coat to the floor. No. Susan. I thought I might have to fight them off, allowing the cycle enough time to work its magic, but the horror commenced as soon as their coats began twirling in the running washing machine. As Stephen spun around in the doorway, his limbs began to crumple inwards, shrinking in a matter of seconds. He screamed in excruciating pain, as did Susan, who was still walking down the stairs. Parts of his skin tore and bled, as had been the case for most of the victims in the machine, and there sounded a series of thuds from the staircase. Stephen, mostly crippled and reduced to half of his size, ran out into the entryway, and I followed him. "No, Susan. Susan," he cried, cradling his shrinking wife who had tumbled to the floorboards and cracked her head open. "What have you done? You monster." Stephen dropped his wife and turned his attention to me, charging with a furious glint in his eyes. I watched with a mixture of relief and horror as the man lunged forwards, shrinking as he went, and fell at my feet as a shriveled, pinky-sized, lifeless husk, wearing blood and guts on the outside of his corpse. I slumped to the floor of the entryway, eyeing the miniature corpses of the halls, making sure they were truly dead. And then, after an unknown period of time, I hazily walked into the kitchen, poured a bottle of vodka across the dining table, and set it ablaze with a lighter. The fire spread quickly. As I was walking towards the open front door, I noticed Stephen's wallet on a dresser. There was £80 inside. Not quite enough for a new phone screen, and certainly not enough compensation for the horror I endured. But it sufficed. I wasn't willing to spend a moment longer in that house.